but where do you think the next 5 to 10 years are with the economy and the dollar really losing its value? I'm hearing you say in the next 5 years.
Yeah, look, obviously more money could be suckered into this bubble. I mean, who am I to say that, they can't succeed in growing the bubble bigger? I mean, look how big the overall bubble has grown, and how many years they've kicked the can down the road. So, I don't know. There's a good chance that we're nearing the end of it now, that it's already so crazy with excitement, that there's already so many people in it, that the trade is already so crowded that there's little upside left. In fact, Bitcoin is lower today than it was in, I think, in April of this year. So, why hasn't it gone up with all this hype, all this advertising? You watch a network like CNBC, almost every other ad is a Bitcoin crypto ad. I mean, that's nonstop.
Really?
The network, in order to go on the network, you pretty much have to profess your love of Bitcoin. Everybody loves Bitcoin, all the anchors, everybody loves it. Even though they also love the Fed, they love Bitcoin too, because, they're advertisers. They want to appease the advertisers. They won't even let you on unless you are positive on Bitcoin. And then, they keep bringing on these shills that are working in cryptocurrency companies and own all this Bitcoin. And they'll say, well, what do you think of Bitcoin today? I mean, should people sell it? Of course not. Everything is great. I mean, they bring these guys on like they're objective, but they have a huge vested interest in propping up Bitcoin because their entire livelihood is dependent on Bitcoin rising. And so they need people to keep buying it. So they're never going to be objective. It's always like, yeah, it's going to go up. Don't worry about it. It's great. Buy. Now, some people say, well, Peter, you say the same thing about gold, right? You need people to buy gold. No, I don't. I mean, gold's going to go up whether I convince people to buy it or not. I mean, the gold market is so big, I have absolutely no ability to influence it. Whereas, in crypto is small enough that
one person tweets it who's influential.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to have an effect on gold, by tweeting about it like Bitcoin. And I don't, gold is a small part of what I advocate that people do. I mean, I think gold's a good store of value. It's a good place to keep your savings if you don't have a better use for it, but it's not an investment. Now, I think right now gold is underpriced. So I think in a way it's got features of an investment now because I think it's really cheap, because the market, and this is ironic when it comes to gold, because we're getting all this inflation. Or at least people are seeing all the inflation. We're all talking about inflation because groceries are getting more expensive. Energy, everything is going way up. Yeah. I mean, and people are saying, but look at gold. Gold is going down. We're having all this inflation and gold's going down. It must not be an inflation hedge anymore. And what people don't get is that gold 20 years ago was under $300 an ounce. So it's gone up a lot when supposedly we had no inflation. We actually had inflation. It's just that we weren't talking about it. But what's hurting gold now is that traders are making a bad bet, right? You have highly leveraged traders who control a lot of money. They're convinced that when the Fed tightens monetary policy, when it ends QE and starts raising rates to fight inflation, this is going to hurt gold. Because historically, when the Fed is raising rates, it could be bad for gold. Except the Fed is not going to raise rates nearly enough to hurt gold. In fact, it's not going to raise them enough to bend the inflation curve. They're not really going to fight inflation. They're just pretending they're going to fight inflation. They may never even get into the ring, right? They may just concede the fight without even, getting involved. But if they do get in the ring, they're going to get knocked out by inflation, because inflation is already double digit if you measure it honestly. But even with the government's, doctored up CPI, 7% inflation, you can't fight 7% inflation with 1% interest rates if we even get that high. You need much higher interest rates than that to make a difference. And the Fed just can't go there because of its monetary mistakes of the past. It's got the whole nation so levered up on debt. The federal government's, the national debt's almost 30 trillion. We just passed 29 trillion.
I think I remember back in like the 80s or 90s hearing like, oh, it's at $1 trillion or $2 trillion or something. Like, back then. I can't remember.
Yeah, well, it first broke $1 trillion around 1980 when we elected Ronald Reagan. So it's 30 times greater than that. But right now, the cost to the government of the interest expense on the national debt is really about 1%. That's it, the average cost. Well, what if the Fed had to raise interest rates to 5%? The national debt, the cost would explode because we have to refinance all that because it's all short-term paper. Something like a third of the debt's going to mature in the next year. And a lot of that debt that's maturing is at 25 basis points, like 0.25%. What if it matured and then they had to roll it over at 5%? I mean, the cost of the government is astronomical. It doesn't have the money. But also corporations have tremendous amount of debt. They issued debt to buy back stock. Individuals have debt. They borrowed money to buy homes, to buy cars, to buy all kinds of crap on their credit cards. What happens when interest rates go up? So, nobody can afford the type of interest rates that would be necessary to actually rein in this kind of inflation. That's what people just haven't connected those dots yet. They just assume that the Fed could raise interest rates a little bit and that's going to solve the problem. It won't solve the problem. It'll actually unleash an even bigger problem, which is why the Fed's really not going to do anything. And inflation is just going to keep getting worse. Because if the Fed could fight inflation, they would have already done it. They wouldn't have been lying and pretending it didn't exist or claiming it was transitory. They would have taken some preemptive action before it got this bad.
Yeah.
The reason they didn't is because they were afraid of the collateral damage to the economy. Well, if they didn't want to fight inflation earlier when it was smaller because they were afraid it would hurt the economy, they're not going to fight it in the future when it's even bigger, and fighting it then would do even more damage to the economy. So they're all talk, right? They're all bark and no bite when it comes to inflation fighting. And when the markets figure that out, then gold is going to go ballistic because people are going to realize that the dollar is a bottomless pit.